Okay, let's go ahead and get started today. Appreciate everyone joining us for this month's webinar. It's a very exciting topic I'm sure you're all excited about. Living in the world of accounting and open air, and we're going to talk through deferred and WIP management processes and scenarios. So my name is Ron Bro. I'll be taking you through this today. In our journeys working with many professional service organizations, software companies, we run across a lot of different scenarios. And so we're going to talk through those and kind of talk through some of the challenges, some of the solutions, and hopefully you'll walk away with some new information. But we're going to focus on the following scenarios. We're going to talk about prepayments, managed service contracts, fixed payment schedules, annual subscriptions, and fixed fee milestones. One note, I think on the original agenda for today's meeting, we had mentioned revenue containers. We are not going to cover revenue containers today. It's an old feature that I could do a whole webinar on, and not something that's very popular and used by many. So if you're interested in learning more about that, feel free to go through Suite Answers or contact TopStep, and we'd be happy to talk you through that. So just one agenda change for today. Okay, so as most of you hopefully know, OpenAir supports is one of the differentiators for OpenAir is the strong ability to separate invoicing and revenue recognition on a project by project basis. So this gives you lots of flexibility and controls to be able to generate your WIP and deferred revenue account amounts accurately inside of OpenAir. So what is WIP and what is deferred revenue? At least from how OpenAir defines it, and I believe this is probably following accounting practices. But there are two reporting values in OpenAir and the summary values, WIP and deferred. So WIP is defined as where you've taken more revenue than you've invoiced. And it's a simple calculation, but you can never go negative. So if you've taken $100,000 of revenue, but you've invoiced $50,000, then you would have a $50,000 WIP balance. However, if you've recognized $50,000 and you have billed $100,000, then you would get into a deferred revenue report. So when the invoicing is greater than revenue, you get a positive deferred revenue, and vice versa for the WIP calculations. So those are two standard reporting values inside of OpenAir that you can report on in your summary reports. We also see where some customers will have some custom calcs that they'll require, where they do want to see where the difference between invoicing and revenue is positive or potentially goes negative. So we have also created those sorts of calculations so that you can see that in reports as well. So that's another option if you're looking to have a single calc that shows positive or negative, depending on what you're looking at WIP versus deferred. So the scenarios we're going to talk through today is, the prepayment / deposits, managed services, where we'll paint a scenario, fixed payment schedule, subscriptions, and fixed fee. So we're going to talk through each of these, kind of how the billing rules and the revenue rules work together here to be able to generate WIP and deferred revenue balances. So prepayments. The simple concept is customer prepays for hours for you. And so generally we see customers that they will generate an OpenAir invoice for a fixed amount for so many hours at a certain rate, and they'll send that to their customer, and the customer pays that prepayment, and then we basically can burn against that. And then there's the concept of there's prepayment where each month the customer gets a burn down invoice, and then there's prepayment where the customer doesn't get another invoice from the system. So we'll talk about both of those scenarios and how they're a little different from each other. And then deposits. We run into deposits quite a bit, where a customer gets invoiced for a deposit, but it's a little different than a prepayment, where the customer, we use the deposit to write down the invoices. And so we'll talk a little bit about the difference there and how OpenAir can handle that scenario. So let's talk about prepayment hours, where the customer will receive the initial invoice, and they will also see the hours burned as well at each month as hours are entered in the timesheet. So you would generally see where you would have a fixed fee invoice generated in OpenAir sent to the customer or sent to your financial system to be sent to the customer. And then we'll talk about the revenue setup. And the revenue setup is really driven by what the customer is going to see. If the customer is going to see hours at a $0 rate, but so a $0 invoice, that's one way to provide data to your customer. Or if they're actually going to see dollars on the invoice, that's a different option. So we'll talk about both of those scenarios. So if you are generating an invoice monthly post the prepayment invoice and the customer wants to see the hours only, we don't need dollars, then generally what we see is where there's a fixed fee rule for the prepaid amount, and then there is a time billing rule with a $0 rate card and an hours cap. So I'm buying 160 hours up front, and I go ahead and pay that. I would then put a time billing rule for $0 per hour and 160-hour cap. And then you may have a clause in your contract that you can then bill above once you hit the 160 to a spillover rule that actually has an actual rate in dollars for those services after the prepaid amount is burned. So the ease of this is, we can use charge stages in all these scenarios to manipulate how we see the data in OpenAir, as well as how we report on it and how we filter it in or out. In this scenario, the charge stages can all be the same. So the fixed fee goes into an open charge stage, the $0 go into an open charge stage, and then there's no billing duplication here. Everything's clean, and there's no impact on reporting, on any financial reporting you're doing. So this is a clean option. On the revenue setup, though, it gets a little tricky here, and there's a trick for us old-timer OpenAir folks. You would have to use a time project billing rule as part of this, the revenue rules. But you might ask, well, how could I use a time billing rule if I don't have a billing rule to take revenue, because we're using a $0 one up to the cap? Good question. So what you would do in that scenario is you would actually have 4 billing rules. We've described 3 of them. The 4th one would be a billing rule with the rate card for all hours, but you would mark it as inactive. And you would also need to have it positioned as the first billing rule. You can reorder billing rules, as most of you will know. And so if you have an inactive billing rule, obviously when you run billing each month, it will not run, so it will never get on into the invoicing module. But when you run revenue at the end of the month, the revenue will key off of this inactive rule. It will pull the rate for all the hours, and it will generate revenue based on the hours entered times the rate card rates. So what is our WIP deferred impact? So in this scenario, we will have pre-billed. So we have invoiced, and then we'll take revenue month over month. So we'll be in a deferred revenue scenario up until the prepayment is burned. And then depending on what you do after the prepayment, you may have ability to bill those overspill hours at the end of each month. And then generally that would cause a zero impact to both deferred and WIP once you get past the prepayment cap. So that's the scenario where the customer's getting an invoice each month, but it's a $0 invoice. The other option is the customer getting an invoice, but it is not a $0 invoice. There's actually hours, dollars, and on the invoice, but the invoice total should be 0. So they're obviously not going to double pay you, but we need to be able to reduce that invoice. So the way that we see this set up in OpenAir is obviously, again, our fixed fee rule, and then our time billing rule with our rate for the services. And then there's a feature in OpenAir called a retainer. You may have noticed it if you're not using it inside the invoice module. And what a retainer does is allow you to create a customer specific dollar amount, kind of similar to a customer PO, that you can then apply to invoices, is where it differs from customer POs. And so when you create the invoice, you can apply the retainer amount to the invoice, which would then create a $0 invoice that would then get sent to the customer. So what you would need, some of the setup here, again, manipulating the charge stages, we would want a charge stage for the monthly dollar charges, because we want to be able to exclude those from reports. We don't want to double count how much we're billing. We can also use charge stages as filters in some of the custom calculations, so we can get those accurate project reporting. The retainer is a per customer basis, and you can also link retainers to customer POs if you're using POs. And then that drawdown to draw down to the prepayment amount is burned. You may also have an over the cap billing rule on this scenario as well, but it would go to an open charge stage that you would then be able to then put on invoices to the customer, different from the other charge stage we discussed. So in this scenario, the revenue is actually pretty simple. You would use either a simple as billed rule filtered by the charge stage you want to use as revenue, or you could do a time billing rule filtered on the time billing rule that you would use for this scenario. So either of those would work for that. From a WIP deferred impact, if you're doing, depending on how you're taking revenue in this scenario, if you're counting the prepayment as your upfront, then you would be in a deferred revenue scenario up until the point where you have burned the prepayment, similar to our second scenario. So the other scenario we run into is where the customer doesn't receive an invoice after the prepayment, and they won't see another invoice until you have burned through the prepayment. So again, this one is not too different, but we'll talk it through quickly. In this scenario, you would do a fixed fee rule for the prepay. You would have your $0 rate card rule that you would have go to another charge stage, but this would be a non-invoiceable charge stage. So you can set that flag on the charge stage so that when you create invoices, none of these charges would ever get picked up. And then you could have your overage billing rule for the over the prepayment amount, if that's appropriate. Again, the charge stage for the $0 would be non-invoiceable, and the scenario is clean from a billing perspective. All your billing and reporting should work well, and you don't need any custom calcs to manipulate your reports. From an invoicing perspective, this kind of falls into scenario one we talked about, where we need that ghost rule, that inactive time billing rule on our project, so that we can focus our time project billing revenue rule against that, just to pull in the revenue there. And again, we're going to be in a deferred revenue scenario until the prepayment is earned. Then we can start potentially billing over that. Okay, so prepayment of hours, no invoice generated in OpenAir. So this one we see a lot as well, where a customer will send the prepayment or the upfront payment outside of OpenAir and from their financial system, whatever that might be, but you have to handle it in OpenAir. So you don't have that prepayment. So in this scenario, we could do a time billing rule with a rate and card for services. That could be for a $0 amount, or it could be for a rate card. You could do even an as-billed or a time project rule. But what the downside of this scenario is you're never going to really have that accurate deferred revenue reporting, because you don't have that invoice. So you don't have that clear identification that there was a prepayment. It would require kind of finance to avoid rebilling or overbilling your customer. and then you would really have a zero impact on WIP deferred because of the way that the system is as gets worked each month. You actually would take the revenue the same, so just a simple time and material project that would not impact WIP or deferred. So deposits. So we see a lot of customers that do want to get deposits from their customer. It's different from a prepayment because it is, it's not a recognizable revenue deposit up front. So we would want to make sure that we're accommodating the deposit correctly. So in this scenario, we could still do our fixed fee rule for our deposit. We may want to have a new charge stage to store those deposits so that we can, again, exclude those from different views and reports. Then we could have other rules to, whether it be a fixed fee, it could be a fixed fee project, or it could be a T&M project, or whatever the case might be. You'd have all your standard rules to accommodate the work as it's performed each month. And then this again would benefit from the use of the retainer feature by creating that deposit as a retainer and then applying that deposit to the invoice in OpenAir so that each invoice zeroes out until the deposit is used. So that would apply similarly to the prepayment amount. Again, some of the setup here requires some charge stage manipulation so that we get the right reporting. We can use it on the custom calcs. Retainer usage is very beneficial here so that we can apply that to some invoicing. From a revenue perspective, we can use an as billed filtered by the charge stage. We could use a time project billing, or if it's fixed fee, you could use either a percent complete, or you can do incurred versus forecast for a percent complete calculation. So any of those billing rules would occur. The WIP deferred impact will depend on the type of project, right? If it's a T&M project, then you would most likely have a zero impact to your WIP because as you bill it, you recognize it. Now, if you decide to bill something, if you bill something and decide you're not ready to invoice it, but you want to take revenue, then you could get into a WIP scenario there. Or obviously, if it's percent complete or fixed fee, then obviously in any given month, you could have either a WIP or a deferred revenue scenario, depending on if you've recognized less than what you've billed or you've billed more than you recognized. Then you could have a WIP or deferred balance. So it would flip-flop potentially month over month, depending on the scenario. Okay, so we're going to talk managed services is our next scenario. So in this scenario, what we see customers doing is where they'll put together a managed service relationship, and the managed service includes so many hours per month. And anything above those hours then gets into a billable scenario. So OpenAir does handle this really well. So in the billing rules set up, we have our fixed fee on date rule to put our amount per month that's going to be billed, and then we put that on a repeat so that we bill each month. And then we have our time billing rule for our $0 rate card. And there's something on the time billing rules called a period cap, where you can set instead of setting a cap for the entire project, you can set a cap for a time period. So in this scenario, we could have a cap for the month. And so once you exceed the cap for the month, then it flips into a overflow time billing rule with rate card, so that you then actually get dollars to actually bill in addition to the fixed fee to the customer. So again, some highlights here. You probably want the charge stage to hold those $0, and so you don't actually get those put on an invoice unless you do want them invoiced. It's clean from a billing reporting perspective, and it does require that period cap on the time billing rule we discussed. Okay, I think From a revenue recognition perspective, it's also really clean. We use a simple as billed rule to say as we bill it, we take the revenue. So if we don't exceed the cap, we take the managed service repeating. If we exceed the cap plus time, then we take the revenue for that. So you're in any given period, as long as you're invoicing everything you're doing and you're recognizing all of that work, then there's no WIP or deferred balances in this scenario. Payment schedule. So we see this a bit. This one can be a little bit tricky, where customer wants you to accommodate them by putting, a payment schedule. So let's say, we estimate a project for, $50,000, and the customer says, can you just, instead of, you billing me actuals each month, can you bill me, 5,000 a month for 10 months? There's some benefits to the company to be able to have that controlled amount per month. And then at the end of the months, you do a true up to say, all right, what did we actually bill? And then what is the overage that we need to bill back to the customer to true up the dollar amounts. So in this scenario, we run into where we just have to set up the agreed payment schedule in OpenAir using the fixed fee billing rules. And then we would have a time billing rule with the standard rate card for the services that were sold. And that would go into kind of a separate charge stage, sort of a ghost rule for reporting only. And so then we would exclude that charge stage from any financial analysts or any invoicing. And then we would basically use custom calcs to make sure our reporting is accurate. So as a revenue recognition perspective, we would recognize revenue based on the charges going into that ghost charge stage each month. And so you could have a WIP or deferred balance at any point. In some months you may bill $5,000, but only do $3,000 in work. And in the next month you could have a spike in hours, but a steady billing scenario. So you could go the other way. So your WIP and deferred will go up and down. And at the end of the contract, it's easy to take how much fixed fee did we bill, how much time did we bill, and then what are true up the WIP deferred balances. Using the WIP deferred balances, we can true up the final invoice back to the customer, so we get our proper invoicing amounts. Okay, one more, annual subscription. So we see software companies a lot want to manage their annual subscription, sometimes within OpenAir. And so in this scenario, it's pretty straightforward. You would just do, again, upfront. So generally the subscription is upfront, for the software, but then from a revenue perspective, it is a ratable revenue recognition. So in that scenario, you would have under revenue set up, your fixed fee on date repeating monthly revenue rule that would generate the revenue per month. And then in that scenario, again, you would be in a deferred revenue balance until the end of the contract term. So pretty straightforward for software subscriptions or annual subscriptions. Last but not least, this is our most common scenario that we, all customers that are in professional services work with, and that's where you have fixed fee projects. So in this scenario, you could have fixed fee on date, or you could do fixed fee on milestones. You could have upfront, you could have mid-project milestones, end of the project milestones. So depending on your billing schedule that the customer has agreed to, you would obviously set up all of your billing scenarios to accommodate those billing milestones in the contract. Then from a revenue recognition perspective, we generally see customers following GAAP and 606 compliance. They're doing percent complete. There's two different flavors of percent complete. There's standard percent complete, or there's incurred versus forecast percent complete. I won't go into the difference today. We've done many webinars on percent complete that are available on our website. But generally, then you get that month over month. How did we do? How much did we work? And then, so again, the WIP and deferred will definitely fluctuate greatly in some scenarios. So you may bill in 1 month, you may go multiple months where you don't bill at all, but you're doing work. So you want to be able to take that revenue for those months and then be able to see the delta between what's been invoiced and what's been recognized. And so it depends on the timing of the billing scenarios, whether you fall into a WIP or deferred impact. So in summary, a lot of the setup defines what do you want to show your customer? Like, do they need to see hours for prepayments or do they not? Do they just need the upfront invoice? And if they do want to see hours, do they need to see hours at a rate or hours at a zero rate? You could also obviously just send them time reports on the time spent that month as well. It's another option that doesn't impact invoicing. But those are some of the decisions and scenarios that will define some of the setup here. You want to make sure that you consider the reporting impact. So if you're, creating these charge stages to store the additional detail you need, make sure if you're storing actual real dollars based on rate cards, you want to make sure that when you're reporting, you're not, getting double reporting. So make sure that you pay attention to the charge stage and also reporting filters for using those charge stages. And then also check your company policy for any invoicing dependencies to make sure that you're following the policies in OpenAir to make sure you get your customers accurate and approvable invoices so you can get paid quickly. So that's the end of today's session. Obviously, we appreciate you following our webinar series. Everyone knows who TopStep is. We appreciate all of our fans out there. So thank you for your loyalty and your support. I will go ahead and end this webinar.